Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. This is your Net General bringing you another Total War Warhammer 3 Legendary Lord lore video, and today we are doing Drazoath the Ashen. Centuries ago, when Ostrogoth was nearer the peak of his power, he had a run-in with an ambitious young hellsmith known as Drazoath. Perhaps he was overly ambitious or offended the great Ostrogoth, but for whatever reason, Ostrogoth and the Sorcerer's Council banished Drazoath from Zarnagrund to the Black Fortress. For more than 1,000 years, the dark, burning spire of the Black Fortress has stood sentinel over the crossing place of the River Ruin at the southern edge of the Mountains of Morn and guarded the border of the Chaos Dwarf Empire of Ash and Suffering. It is a nightmarish place of soot, blackened iron, and jagged rock. Burning magma runs through it like lifeblood. It has been centuries since his banishment to the Black Fortress, and Drazoath has since risen to become its lord through his innate cunning and bitter, ruthless ambition. Now known as Drazoath the Ashen, a twisted, power-hungry creature and potent sorcerer. Drazoath's power has grown over the decades, and there are few sorcerers now in the service of Hashut who can match him in arcane might or knowledge in the creation of war machines and demon binding. In battle, Drazoath is both a mighty sorcerer and an able warrior who leads his war hosts from the fore, mounted upon the great Taurus Cinderbreath, bringing fire and ruin down upon the enemy. He also has undisputed mastery of the Legion of Asgore, a potent army of Chaos Dwarves, Hobgoblin slave soldiers, and Infernal Guard, who are Dawizar, who have dishonored themselves, seeking retribution in combat or death. All are based at the Black Fortress, where their duty is to raid across the river and patrol the savage wastes of the southern Darklands to maintain the Chaos Dwarves' tentative dominion over the deadly and monster-plagued expanse. But for all his power and the forces at his command, Drazoath is all too keenly aware that he has reached an impasse and his black-hearted ambition can take him no further. For the Black Fortress is many leagues away from the center of the Chaos Dwarf Empire at Zarnagrund, and it is ill-regarded. The voice of this Lord of Exiles carries little weight with the great conclave of Hashut's priesthood, and in particular, none with Ostrogoth Ironhand. Ostrogoth is ancient beyond measure, and at last his powers have begun to wane, so Drazoath's dream of a triumphant return to Zarnagrund are slowly kindled in his spiteful breast. Drazoath needs above all a great victory to seal his prominence, but when Ostrogoth finally falls, a great flow of fresh captives and plunder into the coffers of the Chaos Dwarf Empire would go far to expand his influence beyond his own blighted domain. This is, however, not proving to be such an easy ambition for Drazoath to achieve, thanks to the enemies which continually beset the Black Fortress, which, after all, are the reasons for his existence at all. And so, he has been left wanting. When dark rumors began to reach the Lord of the Black Fortress of a monstrous horde rising in the east and crushing all before it, Drazoath consulted the flames and embers of Hashut's sacrificial altars for what they portended. He saw in them dire peril and opportunity in the coming of Tamurkhan, and so, with the malefic intent that so characterizes his cold heart, he drew up his plans accordingly. Tamurkhan, a champion of Nurgle, who currently took the form of an enormous rotting ogre tyrant, led a horde the likes of which Drazoath had never witnessed. On the opposite bank of the river, across the shallow causeways, was the only place a force as large and unwieldy as Tamurkhan's horde might cross into the Darklands for many leagues. Lord Drazoath the Ashen had drawn up his army to this place. Here, Tamurkhan's thousands would face rank after rank of compact, regimented figures, encased from head to toe in thick ornate armor woven from smoldering steel scales and thick, blackened plates. Brutal blades and strange ornate weapons beating a deadly rhythm in unison against brazen shields. All throughout their lines were batteries of nightmarish war engines, demon-fused cannon, and gaping-mouthed mortars. At the flanks, great mobs of hobgoblin slave soldiers cowered and fretted under the cruel lashes of their overseers, ready to be spent as a living shield of blood and bone for their callous masters. Tamurkhan, the rotting champion of Nurgle, knew he had the power and might to force the crossing, even against the legendary wrath of the Chaos Dwarves of Zarna-Grund. The sheer fury and monstrous power of his horde would see to that, but the cost would be high indeed. As for the commander of the defending force, Drazoath knew that he faced a battle of a kind unwitnessed in the lands of Zar since time immemorial, and his reason calculated the odds poorly in his favor. Yet, even in the face of certain defeat, Lord Drazoath was unafraid, for he was of a race prouder and more stubborn than any upon the face of the world, and thus was his charge, and the charge of all those consigned to garrison the mighty Black Fortress, to fight and die with the breath of hatred upon their lips against the foes of Zarna-Grund. Though death and destruction was inevitable, he would not disgrace the Chaos Dwarves of Zar, nor sell cheaply the legacy of Hashut, his father in darkness. Each of the two generals perhaps had an echo of some other outcome of the confrontation rather than mutual destruction in mind from the start. But first, both pride and the desires of the dark gods must be born. There would be blood. The war horns rang out, and carnage commenced. For many hours the tide of chaos crashed upon the army of the Lords of Hashut. In wave after wave it advanced upon the thin line of Chaos Dwarves, only to be beaten back under a hail of arrows and gunfire. Strange missiles leapt from the Chaos Dwarf ranks and fell upon their enemies with great resounding crashes like thunder. Warriors and beasts were blown into so many pieces of shredded flesh and mangled iron, or burned, the flames charring their flesh, even under the waters of the Black River ruin. Yet, like the tide, the army of Tamurkhan came on relentlessly. As one warrior fell, another stepped into his place. Soon, the supply trains of the army of Zar began to come under attack from above. Winged beasts, rotting winged corpse vultures, and demon furies struck from the skies, while sorcerer's lightning arced down to burn and blast, causing powder kegs to erupt in lethal fireballs, incinerating all around them. Soon enough, the Chaos Dwarves' guns slowed. Many were struck silent, their ammunition and powder spent. Slowly, the Horde regrouped to renew the attack, and this time the Dolgan war mammoths were to lead the assault. And behind them, heavily armored Chaos Knights and warriors were taking up key positions before the foe. The morning's battle had simply been a preliminary attempt to draw the enemy's fire. The Chaos Dwarves had unknowingly wasted their cannons and powder on the most expendable parts of the Horde. Mutated cultists, wild monsters, savage or mindless spawn, and those so blessed by Chaos's corrupting touch, they were glad to seek death rather than live another day. Of course, some sacrifice had been necessary. Thousands of Kurgan lay dead or dying, as well as hundreds of Tamurkhan's plague ogres. That the path to glory was awash with blood, no one could ever deny. Drazoath the Ashen, for his part, was neither a fool nor inexperienced as a general, and saw immediately the peril his forces were in. Swiftly, he commanded a detachment of infernal guard to hold the line until slain, and ordered his fellow demonsmiths to work with fear and mind-clouding magics to hurl the hobgoblin slave soldiers at their command into the teeth of the foe, to delay them, while the greater and more valuable Chaos Dwarf force and its engines of war sought a retreat. The plan, however, did not survive the charge of the ground-shaking war mammoths across the causeway, and even the Infernal Guard could not hold back such a weight of muscle and fury, and the center of the line of the far bank was shattered in the huge beast's first mighty assault. The retreat became a disarrayed rout as the weapons of the Kurgan fell mercilessly upon the orcs and hobgoblins who made up the greatest part of the slave army, and many more of the cowardly creatures died in the rush to escape as the panicked hobgoblins fought and clawed over each other in their eagerness to flee. Those not trampled to death by their comrades were simply buried and suffocated in the press. Isolated blocks of Chaos Dwarves stood their ground rather than face the ignominy of being cut down in flight. Both at their war machines and in defensive squares of steel-shod warriors, they fought savagely and bravely, but they stood little chance as the Horde washed over them. There was great slaughter on both sides, but soon the victory was Tamurkhan's, and despite this, Drazoath, his demonsmiths, and the core of his legion made good their retreat, covered by a cloud of ash and sulphurous darkness, back to the safety of the Black Fortress. It was Sail the Faithless, sorcerer and advisor to Tamurkhan, he of the twisted flesh and serpent's tongue, that was chosen as an emissary in Tamurkhan's stead to deliver his word to the Chaos Dwarves, now holed up into their near-impregnable fortress. Although useful, Tamurkhan ultimately considered him expendable should the Dawizar choose to make a point by destroying him. Tamurkhan's message to the Chaos Dwarf Lord was thus: "Know that I, Tamurkhan, son of the great Kurgan, master of hosts, bringer of desolation, champion of the Lord of Decay, speak. Would you, Lord Drazoath, perish, knowing that your land will be despoiled and your fortress plundered? By all, witness of the dark gods, you have fought with honor and brought glory to thy master. Now yield without shame. Our war is not with the lords of Hashut, but with the lands of men. Join us, grant us the blessing of steel, and thy fell arts of war, and the spoils of victory shall fall to all alike, as it has been before between the Kurgan and the sons of Tsar. Let it be again, and a pact struck between us." Drazoath heard these words and dismissed Tamurkhan's threat to the Black Fortress as an idle one. And yet, all around the lands he had sworn to dominate were scourged and ravaged by the wolf now at his door. A calamity his brethren in distant Zana Grund would not forgive. But his wicked heart leapt as he thought of the legendary riches of the West, of iron and stone and gemstones, of the plunder of slaves, of gold and flesh and blood, but most of all, of the lore he might glean. For many years now, stories had reached the dark empire of the Chaos Dwarves of the powerful battle magic and war engines that had risen in the human lands of the West. Tales spoken of by caravan masters seeking to carry favor, and confessions extorted under torture from captives and freshly bought slave stock. No doubt was in Drazoath's mind that these purely human creations would prove inferior to the craftsmanship of the demonsmiths of Tsar, but there would be great merit in their measuring. Should he lead an expedition and match the might of his legion against the humans of the West in victory and take their secrets for his own, then among Hashut's dark priesthood, his star would rise anew. And so the flames of glory to come were fanned in Drazoath's cold and spiteful breast. None of this reasoning the Lord of the Black Fortress allowed to slip before the baleful sorcerer before him. Drazoath would ensure the bargain would prove long and arduous, before, at last, he would allow a pact to be sealed. Over the next several months, the Chaos Horde aided the Chaos Dwarves in the long-disused mine known as Gulakva, driving out a Black Orc tribe, and set out ranging far and wide with great slaughter along the Scalded Delta, sending a steady stream of captives to the Dark Empire. In return, caravans pulled by strange, ash-blackened beasts and steaming, clanking machines, the likes of which no Norscan had ever seen, arrived night and day at Gulakva, bearing bushels of weapons and darkly forged war gear to re-equip the Horde. Ceaselessly, deep within the bowels of the Black Fortress and the distant Tower of Gorgoth, hellish furnaces which burned flesh and souls as much as coal and tinder blazed and hammered and resounded with sacrificial screams, as under Drazoath's direction preparations were made for his legion and its malevolent engines of war to go west with Tamurkhan's horde, not as followers, but allies against a chosen foe. The sworn pact was that for the aid of the demon smith's might in bringing down the great city of Magnus the Pious, the dwarves would in return have their pick of prisoners and battlefield plunder, and then the bargain would be complete. As preparations were made for the journey west, and in honor of the bargain struck, Tamurkhan and his warriors joined in battle alongside the legions of Asgore against one of their most terrible ancient foes, the dragon Omdra the Dread. This monster of legend had stirred once more, and soon its dominion carried across the northern plain of bones, and its colossal black-winged shadow scattered all before it in nightmare and terror. No mere beast, however great its size, was Omdra, but an ancient and wicked creature, with dark magics to match even the vaunted skills of Sile, the preeminent sorcerer amongst Tamurkhan's horde. At the inhuman will of Omdra, gargantuan moorworms rose up from the black sands to give battle alongside packs of wanton and hungry crypt ghouls, to whom the dragon was no less than a god, and threw themselves with savage piety against the Kurgan. In this battle were thousands slain, both Kurgan and Chaos Dwarf together. At great cost in blood and sorcery was the dragon god herself gravely injured and driven away to slumber beneath the bones of her dead kin, her threat to the desolation of Asgore broken, at least for a time. In return for this effusion of slaughter on their behalf, the servants of Hashut honored Tamurkhan with a gift of a war axe fit to his stature, a darkly enchanted blade to replace the tyrant which had shattered on the granite-hard skin of a moorworm in battle. Also, at Tamurkhan's behest, they took the near 100 giants that still fought with the Horde and worked their arts of forgecraft and sorcery on them, encasing them in plated iron and fitting them with great hooked blades and picks, the better to scale and sunder the fortifications the Horde must face when it reached its destination. These ironclad monstrosities became known as siege giants. After a time, Tamurkhan grew impatient to move onwards, wary that his horde's numbers were steadily bleeding away battle by battle, and conscious too that the omens were beginning to turn against him. Dark rumors and whispered words borne upon wings of sorcery from 1,000 leagues northward spoke that other forces even now assailed the Empire, and other mighty champions clamored for the Dark God's attention with their great and terrible deeds. Even within his own ranks, while his might remained unquestioned, as did Tamurkhan's devotion to the Father of Decay, some spoke of the changes recently wrought upon his stolen tyrant's body, and that they were perhaps a mark of the Plague God's judgment. Either that ascension or destruction was soon to be at hand. Great had been Tamurkhan's glory, for he had carved a trail of desolation across half the world, it seemed. He had led the Horde where warlords before him had feared to tread. The number of bodies that lay at his feet could not easily be counted, but the city of the thrice-cursed Magnus he had promised the Dark Gods had yet to be delivered. At last, in a council of war, Tamurkhan declared the time had come to render up the final victory to the Chaos Gods, and the horde of the Maggot Lords set forth once again westwards, where they meant to cross the World-Edge Mountains at Death Pass, which at this time was the least opposed and closest route, for at the time a great army of Orcs and Skaven had fought each other to near annihilation in a battle to control it. With the lands of the west so close now, and the horde having slaughtered and slain its way so far, fresh impetus and vigor filled the horde as it crossed the dark lands in the shadow of the Ash Ridge Mountains, and all were driven before it. Tamurkhan's savage legend having become common currency amongst the misshapen Ghoul King, brutal orcs, and predatory hobgoblins that lived in the western Darklands. At the entrance to the wide pass, they were met by a full third of the strength of the Legion of Asgore, and the serried regiments of Infernal Guard waiting lockstep for them, with Drazoath himself at their command, mounted upon a great burning beast like a winged bull. With them were drawn up strange iron and bronze engine caravans, half supply train, half war machine, driven forward by steam-hissing wheeled carriages they called Iron Demons. They were a bizarre and frightening sight to behold. They drove on to Death Pass, all but unopposed, its denizens skulking terrified in the shadows at the baleful sight of the great horde and the smoke-belching armored column that ran beside it. And so it was that in the dying of the summer of the year 2510 of the Imperial Reckoning, that like the wrath of a terrible and despoiling god, the horde of Tamurkhan fell upon the unprepared lands of the Border Princes. Life within the Border Princes is hard and full of danger, and yet the coming of the Chaos Horde of Tamurkhan was a disaster unlike anything these hard-scrabble lands had seen for centuries. After their long travail and the hardships that they had endured in the Darklands, the Kurgan, ogres, and foul beasts within the horde looked upon the rolling green downs and tangled, verdant forest before them, and had never before seen a land so rich and ripe for despoil. They fell upon it like starving jackals set loose in a sheepfold. All but uncontrollable in their frenzy, the horde broke up almost at once into 1,000 independent bands that ravaged all before them like a wildfire, drowning one petty kingdom after another in its own blood, and leaving all barren and blasted in their wake. Great heaps of bodies mounded beneath grisly standards, where any had the temerity to stand before them, vastly outnumbered and outmatched even the largest and most military-capable alliance of the baronies and principalities, a so-called Confederation of the Eagle, whose army of skilled veteran mercenaries met the oncoming horde under the generalship of Leopold the Black, an infamous sellsword general of great renown, could not slow, let alone stop the horde. The human army, comprised of armored knights and well-disciplined pikemen, was crushed utterly, and the fleeing saviors ridden down by death-hungry Kurgan. Leopold being almost alone in escaping the field, albeit at the expense of his own troops' horrific demise. Restoring order in the host, once they had broken up, cost Tamurkhan and his chieftains valuable time, and meanwhile the Legion of Asgore, which had seen its own share of rich pickings and already began dispatching trains of captives and plunder back to the Darklands, proved infuriatingly difficult for Tamurkhan to hurry. Matters worsened as, without warning, hurricane storms rolled in from the mountains, driving sheets of rain that turned the downs into sodden quagmires of mud, while the voices of hungry spirits in the winds howled between the peals of thunder. Day after day the storm went on unabated, unnatural and horrific in its intensity, driving chimera and other fell creatures down from the heights to rip apart fleeing refugees and their pursuers. News reached Tamurkhan that Blackfire Pass was awash with a flood, and there was no way the land machines of the Chaos Dwarves could hope to attempt its crossing. Tamurkhan raged murderously, lashing out at his own followers and raving that he heard the laughter of the dark gods in the storm's voice. It was Lord Drazhoath who unexpectedly provided a solution in collating such scorched books and blood-stained parchments as his forces had uncovered from their path of destruction. He had learned of a pass named in some texts as Winter's Teeth. Splintered and inhospitable, it was said to have been the site of dwarf mines and citadels long since abandoned, and the pass itself was all but forgotten. But it offered an alternative route further west that might allow them to cut up into the belly of the Empire from an unexpected quarter. The unnatural storm lessened in its intensity the further west they went, and when war parties sent to scout the pass vowed it was all but untouched by the havoc that had been raining down on them, Tamurkhan immediately seized upon it, and set the drums of the Horde beating in frenzied motion. The acolytes of Nurgle answered the call keenly, but others did not. Many of the ever-superstitious Kurgan saw the unnatural storm as a sign of the Dark God's disfavor. Others muttered yet that the lands westward lay open and ripe for the taking, and were yet untouched by the despoiling Horde. Those champions who did not embrace the Plague God demanded the omen's meaning. Exile threw burning runes of prophecy across the lattices of boiling elf marrow. All the signs seemed to point to disaster and death. When informed of these omens, Drazoath merely smiled coldly and turned away, while Tamurkhan would have none of such predictions. His fate, his glory, was but a handful of footsteps away. After all, Tamurkhan declared, the vanguard that breached the pass reported only some scatterings of resistance from black-cowled goblins that fled in the panic when confronted by Kurgan's bared blades. They had sent such weaklings to flight and slaughter many times before. Why should they fear them now? Once they'd reached the pass through the Black Mountains, the going grew easier, as the pass was far more level than one might have imagined. High above them, the peaks and rock faces were crowned with effigies of ancient dwarf ancestor god, heroes and runic inscriptions, weathered by time and the fury of the elements, but far from erased. Setting a brutal pace by midday, the foremost warriors soon found themselves marching through recently abandoned encampments and litter piles at the open mouths of caves, foul and unkempt. They showed clear signs of goblin-kind as their makers, and many of the campfires at their fore still smoked, and the stench of charred flesh hung upon the air. Further on, the Kurgan came across remains of their own kind, those riders who had scouted ahead of the Horde and not returned. They passed the grisly, mutilated bodies of former comrades, staked or hung beside the path, where the pitiless greenskins had left them to be found, while heat cracked, human and horse bones littered throughout the campfires spoke of the fate of others. At these crude barbarities, the Kurgan laughed, for they honored the dark gods and had seen far worse in their time. Indeed, they had done worse themselves. The Chaos Dwarves were indifferent, their demeanor neither heightened nor dimmed by the findings. As for the ogres, the scent of burning flesh merely stirred their famous insatiable appetites, and made them only more impatient for battle. Soon enough, sporadic goblin raiding parties began to harass the Horde, claiming the lives of those at the edges of the column, and disappearing back into the darkness. As the hours progressed towards true nightfall, the Horde's casualties started to mount, but Tamurkhan ordered the Horde onward still. He would stand no delays, now he was so close to his prey, and pushed his host on until they had reached a point where the ancient maps they followed described a wide shoulder of the mountain, its surface hammered flat, where it might be possible for the Horde to encamp with some measurement of cohesion and security before the sun's setting. So it was that after a day of almost continuous harassment, the forward column of the Horde turned into the shadowed vale beneath the high peaks, and was faced by a vast sea of black cloth and leering green faces spread across the wide, stony expanse. Lurid banners flapping and snapping in the chill wind. The night goblins had waited for the Chaos Force to reach a point where there was room enough for its massed tribes to deploy their numbers. Not only did the greenskin battle line spread across the valley edge to edge, perhaps as much as a league across, behind it stretched a mass of shifting darkness as far as the eye could see. Shrouded by the setting sun, the immense forms of giants and hulking spiders the size of mill wheels, towering over, the night goblins below them. As Tamurkhan fixed the foe with his ogre's cataract-white eyes, he knew that many more night goblins were likely to be lurking in adjoining caverns and hidden dens within the peaks, ready to spring. Away from the front line, Exile the Faithless has been trapped with the advance party of Chaos Dwarves, isolated, as the mountainside seemed to collapse, trapping them within a stretch of pass, surrounded by the remnants of high-sided citadels. No sooner had the pall of dust settled and the screams of the crushed and broken died away when the attack began. A shower of black-flighted arrows flew down from the heights above, while from the rock walls around the pass, further deep rumblings emanated. Pack beasts howled, and slave-bearers shuddered and fell as arrows sunk into their hides. But against the Chaos Dwarves' Infernals, who swiftly fell into square defensive formations, the hail of missiles did little. A few shots inevitably found their mark, but they were few indeed, for their Chaos Dwarf-made armor was close-fitting, with barely a chink between overlapping plates. Quickly from behind the spreading dust, screaming steam like the death cries of damned souls, and an iron engine hove into view, dragging behind it a double carriage train, one of fuel, the other a heavy tubular cannon, around which a trio of hellsmiths were hurriedly chanting and spraying boiling hot blood onto its bell-like casing. The clanking and hissing machine quickly became the favored target of the unseen archers in the heights, and the enemy fired their arrows as hastily as they could, but the Iron Demon thundered forward undaunted, shaking clear of the rubble and debris to take up the rear of a now triangular formation of Chaos Dwarf warriors, into the center of which Exile retreated, with his own bodyguard, the Chaos Spawn known as Nightmare, stumbling and rolling behind him. No sooner had the Faithless gained the center of the formation than the import of the ominous rumbling noises bore fruit, and ancient stone doors swung slowly open, and in places the stony ground fell away to reveal wide passageways into the earth. These, like the now gaping entrances into the mountainside, were ancient dwarf works, utterly undetectable until revealed, and they were now controlled by far fouler masters than their creators. Unfolding like the nightmarish oversized parodies of men, crafted from pallid grey flesh and warty scales, stone trolls surged from the blackness within the mountains. There were scores of the huge creatures, their yellow eyes rolling lazily in their lumpen heads, and their faces splitting in moon-wide grins of hunger. Behind them, the black-shrouded figures of night goblins teemed and swarmed forth like rats, their wicked knives flashing in their hands. Gunfire crackled from the Chaos Dwarfed ranks, striking down dozens as they poured forth from their tunnels. But the ambush was well planned, and the distance between the combatants was too close for the assault to be halted in time. In seconds, the battle was joined, and a bloody, chaotic melee ensued. The lumbering trolls and gibbering night goblins surrounded the engulfing and far outnumbered defenders. With pitiless savagery, the Chaos Dwarf Infernals cut down their foes, hacking and slashing through the night goblins, smashing them down, and crushing their squealing bodies underfoot. The Infernals trusted their own great resilience and the strength of their hell-forged armor to protect them from the frenzied press of bodies and stabbing blades. And although some fell, dagger points finding eye slits, carnage was wrought on the attacking goblins by the cruel warriors of the Black Fortress. The stone trolls, however, offered a far graver threat. The dull-witted but brutal creatures wielded crude mauls and double-handed axes with incredible strength that were able to pulverize even the heavily armored Chaos Dwarves with a clean strike, while the wounds they received in return fused closed with frightening speed, as was the gift of their monstrous kind. Where the trolls attacked in numbers, the infernal lines began to buckle and fray, and even though some of the bestial trolls were cut down or hacked apart and dismembered even beyond their abilities for regeneration, Chaos Dwarves lay shattered and slain in their wake, and the teeming night goblins, still spilling in great numbers from beneath the earth, rushed in to press the advantage. Surrounded, suddenly, and frightened for his life, Sael the Faithless, greatly wrathed that his vaunted seercraft had failed him, was consumed by rage, and drew upon the powers of chaos with wild abandon, channeling his sorcerous might into blinding blasts of incandescent lightning, which rippled like a scythe through the night goblins, and turned even the hulking stone trolls to charred skeletons, despite their legendary resistance to witchery. About the Chaos Sorcerer, trailing its own web of smoky shadow, capered the snapping Nightmare. Its mangled shifting limbs plucked screaming greenskins within range of its free greedy maws, which snickered and flashed almost too fast to see, sending up a mist of blackish red blood around it. The Iron Demon ground once more into motion and dragged unknown numbers of night goblins to their death against its wheels and against the many barbs and blades that adorned it. The hellish machine's cannonades fired, shredding troll and night goblin apart before it in a welter of gore, and the war machine seemed to howl and roar like a living thing at the slaughter it wrought. In answer, a weird whistling double cry echoed around the press of the pass, and in hearing it, the night goblins answered with whoops and shrill cries of their own, as from a vast yawning gateway in the mountainside, two freakish and enormous creatures half crawled, half bounded into view. Even Sael the Faithless was momentarily struck aghast, for he had never before seen their like. They were colossal, pumpkin-like things with rubbery, fungoid flesh of unwholesome, yellow-flecked scarlet. Their bodies were swollen like rotten heads, with slavering slit mouths, filled with sword-length fangs as wide as a tower gate. Even as Sael watched, he saw the first of the hulking monsters throw itself heedlessly into the press of battle, uncaring whether it crushed friend or foe beneath its bulk. Its impossibly wide mouth working hungrily, devouring fangs, dragging out screaming rasp of tortured metal as they pierced and severed its steel-plated prey. Beneath the onslaught of the colossal things, one of the infernal regiments disintegrated into bloody mayhem, collapsing one point of the defensive triangle, its survivors overwhelmed and dragged down as they attempted to flee the all-devouring monster behind them. Sael retreated, coughing blood and crackling with stray discharges of power from his sorcerous exertions. Nightmare carving a path for him as he sought refuge, putting the smoke-spitting, gore-splattered Iron Demon and its carriage train behind him, and the Twin Festers from beneath the earth. As he did so, the Hellsmiths atop the weapon carriage spun the blackened bronze cannon to face its target, twisting runes and sigils glowing white-hot, swimming and flowing like water across the tarnished surface. A single thunderous report sounded, and the mighty bolt of molten fire flew from the muzzle and struck the foremost of the monsters, blasting it apart in a sheet of ichor and flaming gruel, like a hammer striking rotten fruit. The thing's huge carcass rolled sideways and seemed to deflate as it fell, spilling a slew of its undigested victims into the dust and crushing a dozen greenskins unlucky enough to be caught in its way. The Hellsmiths on the magma cannon carriage had little time to celebrate their victory, however, as they frantically sought to reload as the second terror was upon them. The Iron Demon shuddered to turn away, but a shrill hiss of escaping pressure foretold the lurching stop that was to follow, as the carriages suddenly shunted into one another with bone-breaking force, and the monster was upon them. Smashing into the gun carriage, there was a grinding clatter as the iron-bronze contraption was overturned and toppled, burning ash and cinders scattered into the air. Hellsmiths, flames licked upon them, scrambled to be clear of the vast slamming jaws, but the Iron Demon itself, one of its wheels hauled clear of the ground by the huge weight that had twisted the carriages, was powerless to move or bring its weapons to bear. The remaining Infernals, still besieged on all sides by an enemy whose bloodlust had only heightened by the carnage the monsters had caused, were too heavily pressed to mount a counterattack, and looked set to be devoured or crushed one after the other, while Sael knew for him to conjure a spell sufficiently powerful to harm, let alone have any chance to slay the monster, would likely kill him too, in his exhausted state. The faithless, however, cursed Tamurkhan loudly for his folly and pride, and prepared to gather the wild vortices of magic that ripple across the battlefield to him, and make an end to this enemy even though it might consume him, knowing that such an action would mark a fitting pyre of destruction for one such as he. Lightning and storm winds played about the Chaos Sorcerer, as at last, with a tortured shriek of metal and steam, carriage couplings snapped, flinging metal explosively in all directions, and the monstrous thing rolled forward, its vast jaws opening wide. Saul laughed in triumphant madness, but before he could loose his spell, the ground beneath the colossal beast erupted upwards in a great sheet of blackness and flame. The blast threw the Chaos Sorcerer off his feet, and he fought with every ounce of his twisted body and tainted soul to maintain his grips on the powers he had summoned, but to no avail. The power ripped out of him like a thrashing whipcord, smashing and withering all it touched, and Saul screamed voicelessly as he too burned. The battle had begun to turn. The night goblins numbered in the tens of thousands, and had isolated the head of Tamurkhan's horde, but they had underestimated the ferocity of the northern warriors, and had begun to be pushed back. Tamurkhan himself fought to the heart of the enemy army, and slew their leader, a shaman atop an enormous albino spider. The greenskins, seeing their boss fall, lost heart, and began to scatter. But the damage to Tamurkhan's horde had been done. Ambushes had sprung up, engaging the entirety of Tamurkhan's column of warriors all at once, causing not insignificant casualties. Lord Drazoath descended from the skies as the greenskins began to scatter, having smote the huge bounding monstrosity, saving Tamurkhan's pet, Exile the Faithless. Lord Drazhoath surveyed the scene of fire and destruction around him, and allowed himself a cursory grimace of displeasure. While the Groby ambush had been fought off, 5 steam carriages were badly damaged, 2 of them irreparably. It would not do. Behind him, the waves of heat radiating from his mount, the mighty winged Baal Taurus Cinderbreath, told him of the beast's satisfaction, if nothing else, as it tore off another haunch of meat and splintered bone from one of the hellsmiths who had so shamefully failed him in the battle, with a wet crunch. The smoke from the burning dead hung thick about him. Drazoath ran his gauntleted fingers through the film of ash that covered a nearby boulder with exaggerated care. He watched the motes dance in the wavering, heated air, studying for portents and shadows in their movement. The distant sound of fireglaves shot, telling him the battle was not quite over yet. Soon, a broken figure was dragged before him in the armored grasp of 2 of his infernal ironsworn, and dumped unceremoniously at his knees. His robes were little more than acid-stained tatters now, the twisted armor scored, pitted, and patched here and there with jagged coils of midnight black ice, despite the heat. While every faltering movement and hissing breath from the man within spoke of agony, still there was arrogance and spiteful power from the burning gaze that shone from beneath the visor. "Sile," Drazoath mocked, "can you speak?" The corroded helm nodded slowly. "Yes, Drazoath, Lord of Ashes, I yet can speak. You owe me your life. It was by Hashut's grace that I slew the beast." A strangled, rasping sound that might have been a laugh echoed from beneath the visor. Drazoath was not amused, and with the merest gesture, the brass-shot stock of his fireglaive slammed into the sorcerer's back, striking him to the floor. "A life that is mine to now take if I so choose," Drazoath pronounced, the distorted runes on his armor beginning to pulse like a fiery, red heartbeat. While behind him, Cinderbreath stirred, sensing his master's will to destroy. "Enough! I owe you my life, dread lord of the Black Fortress. Is that what you wish to hear? Yes, enough from your viper tongue, Sile the Twisted, Sile the Faithless, Broken One. We Drazhoath always collect our debts. Sile nodded slowly and made an expansive gesture with his bloody hand. For the moment he had little choice, so ravaged was his body and soul. But already his mutated flesh was beginning to heal, and his strength would slowly be regained. He would live, no thanks to Tamurkhan's folly. This ambush was ill done, Drazoath pronounced, as if expecting the prone sorcerer to contradict him. Cunning, but botched in its execution. Had the tables been turned, and it had been my forces in such a superior position, not a soul of the Horde would now be left alive. Strange, is it not? Sile rasped in answer, that neither mine own vaunted arts in seercraft, nor your fire-born visions foresaw the danger, dread lord. Do not provoke me, cursed one, Drazoath snarled. I meant no insult, favored of the darkness, but only to state the truth, and curious, is it not? Drazoath's grip reflexively tightened around his warstaff as he looked down on the Chaos Sorcerer with glittering eyes, like flecks of obsidian. He trusted nothing this one said, but now Sile did no more than echo his own thoughts on the matter. What do you imply, Sile? Bandy not words with me, lest you have the desire to be so much as ash on the wind. Something moves against us, Dreadlord. Something subtle and powerful. A murderous and hidden current in the unseen vortex of the eightfold storm. Do you not feel it? Long have I known this, and the closer we tread to the soil of the ancient foe, the stronger it does become. A troubled look flickered across Drazoath's face before he snorted derisively. If it is immortal, then it will die. Such is the fate of all who oppose Hashut's will, the Chaos Dwarf pronounced before turning away dismissively, leaving Sile to sprawl in the ash and dust. Sile laughed bitterly again, sending out a mental summons to recall his spawn Nightmare to return to him from whatever bolt hole it had found to heal its own hurts for a while. Sile lived. So too did the spawn, avatar of his past sins and transgressions. He knew Drazoath was no fool, and unlike the Maggot Lord they followed, nor was he blinded by the promise of absolute power. Yes, he had seen the flicker of doubt and even fear in those coal-black eyes. If it is immortal, then it will die, the Chaos Dwarf Sorcerer Prophet had said, and left the rest unspoken. For as the Kurgan proverbs had it, whom the gods destroy, they first make mighty. Soon they would set foot upon the soil of the thrice-damned Magnus. Soon the matter would be decided. The horde of Tamurkhan continued on through the tunnels, and with some light harassment and rough trekking, they finally made it into the lands of the Empire. The land long ago saved by Magnus the Pious. Tamurkhan had changed over the course of the journey, now appearing even more infected and oozing than he had before, in a manner which pleased the followers of Nurgle that attended him, but to those not of his faith made him even less human, both in aspect and in mind, and ever more difficult to deal with. It was left then to Sile the Faithless, still half crippled himself but slowly recovering his strength, to listen carefully to reports of all the raider bands as they returned to piece together what lay before them. Whilst captives lived, he oversaw the work of their tortures, and when they died, Sile watched as the shaman bound their spirits and continued to question them long into the night. He inspected the weapons of war the raiders brought back as trophies, and bid the hellsmiths of the Black Fortress examine the arms and armor of the enemy with all their considerable expertise, of which they took a special interest in the few firearms taken by the Chaos Marauders. By these means, Sal learned all he could of the enemy's capabilities and of the lands of the Empire before them. Conveying what he could to Tamurkhan decided to split his army into three. The Chaos Dwarves, led by Lord Drazoath, took the route along the river, smashing a series of petty towers and keeps that had been espied along the way. It was the only narrow but serviceable roadway, a remnant of the days centuries before when this land was far more populated and trade strong. This route's more passable terrain being the most suited for the use of the Chaos Dwarf war machine trains. All would depend on speed, for it was clear that surprise was lost to them. Some survivor of the destruction they had wrought in the Border Princes had somehow survived to tell of the Horde. But if fortune favored them, the Empire would still be slow to rally its full might to counter a massive attack from this unexpected quarter. Drazoath and the Horde moved quickly through the Empire's lands. The rapid pace of the advance took its toll upon machines and beasts, and the wake of wreckage and corpses lay strewn behind the route of the march. Here and there, the lone parties of Chaos Dwarves grappled with broken down engines, bent drive shafts, and shattered wheels, while the Kurgan abandoned the weak and the dead at will. The beasts of chaos devoured any that fell to assuage their hunger. Outriders roamed far to the north and reported that the land northward was now deserted, save for a flurry of activity around the great city. And such was Tamurkhan's rage on finding the town of Gunnertag utterly deserted and left aflame, when days before Orbal Vipergut had reported a stalwart defense prepared. The Maggot Lord ordered the flames extinguished and the land foully defaced and desecrated in honor of Nurgle. It was here that the Horde once again came together for the final assault. 21 days after breaking their camp at the foot of the Black Mountains, the Chaos Horde beheld the white-towered city. The Kurgan regarded its high walls and stern defenses, and knew that whole armies might break upon such fortifications. They towered so high that not even a giant might scale them unaided. Tamurkhan brought the Lord of the Black Fortress before him, and bid him speak to the matter. After all, why else had the dwarves of Zard dragged their machines and great siege mortars halfway across the world, if not to topple fortifications such as these? Drazoath laughed. "Walls," he scorned. "I see only piles of sand, crafted by children. Bring my brothers close enough, and we shall take pleasure in fulfilling our bargain and topple them for you." The Chaos Horde arrayed themselves for battle, 5 leagues due south of the great city, and marched towards their goal. Drazoath surveyed the scene and noticed that his enemy had made a fatal error. They had arrayed for battle, expecting a headlong charge, which they might cut down with their guns. But he had brought guns of his own. The Horde brought up to a halt just beyond the range of the enemy's cannon, a handful of which cracked and spattered up mud and soil before them impotently. Once all was ready, Tamurkhan raised his colossal axe high and let it fall. The signal was given. The battle was opened with a deafening roar. The brazen and black iron vessels of destruction began the battle. Eerily glowing projectiles arcing up through the dense mist soon began to fall with frightening accuracy down on the closely packed Empire batteries behind the outer palisade. The explosion of the Chaos Dwarfs' Dreadquake mortar shells, filled as they were with powerful alchemical explosive, was devastating. Great plumes of flames lanced upwards as the explosive force shredded men and cannon with equal ease, shaking the ground itself. As a wave of destruction rippled through the enemy, and confusion and horror broke out in the ranks, a great bloodthirsty cry went up from the Horde, and in an instant the great mass leapt forward as one. Dolgan horsemen and Kurgan knights surged forward. twisting hounds braying at their heels, and behind them came roiling spawn and thunder-footed ogres and trolls, an unholy mass of hate and muscle bent only on slaughter. What followed was a shockingly quick descent into madness and death. Cannon roared on both sides, and men and beasts were torn apart. Rather than stand and die before the onslaught, a wedged column of armed knights broke forward in countercharge, while behind them regiments held their ground stonily, while panicked militia cowered in terror or tried to flee back through the city gates. The skies above blackened with swarms of flies and resounded to the doom-laden wing beats of dragons and chimera, which dissented to smote cannon from atop the high walls and rampaged through the city streets. Horsemen from both sides clashed over the open ground between the two armies. Black-armored Kurgan Chaos Knights fought against glistening Reichsguard, each charging through the rank of the other and turning to charge again. Around them swirled a loose mass of lightly armed cavalry, the marauders of the wastes on one side, the Empire Pistoliers on the other. The crack of the Empire's horsemen's pistols carried above the shouts and trumpet blasts. Behind the advancing horde came the gun carriages of the Chaos Dwarves, hauled slowly forward by the smoke-belching iron demon engines. They unleashed a steady, creeping barrage on the foe, keeping their fire ahead of the battle line until the walls and towers shook with their wrath and burst aflame one after the other. The cavalry battle proved brutal and short, with the Empire's forces wildly outnumbered, soon overwhelmed and scattered, and with a mighty roar, the whole Chaos Horde surged forward and crashed, like a tidal wave, into the outer palisade. As the Empire forces tried to sound a general retreat behind the walls, shells and fireballs fell before the gate, forcing those who would flee to run a gauntlet of death, while those who survived on the battlements above rained down handgun shot and crossbow bolts with frantic desperation in the hope of slowing the unstoppable tide. There was an almighty blast as a dozen hellish war engines spoke at once, and the great portcullis gate of the city, even then as it began to draw closed, exploded in a river of fire and disintegrated slowly into rubble. Its ponderous collapse dragging wall towers to ruin around it and crushing hundreds in their death throes. The Horde's warriors, all but knocked flat by the thunderclap and rush of hot air, howled in triumph, while the soldiers of the Empire screamed hopelessly, their spirits broken. Hook-handed giants scrambled over the debris, dragging huge lengths of chains behind them, tearing cannon and mortars down from the walls, and serving in death as scaling ladders for hundreds of screaming fighters following behind. Plague ogres smashed and slashed their way through desperate pockets of defenders and fell ravenously on the bodies. The dust-filled sky darkened to an unnatural twilight, riven with screaming incendiary rockets, casting a lurid glow over the carnage, as the horde of the Maggot Lord poured into the city, insane with the joy of battle. Drazoath watched as the Maggot Lord stormed the city astride his massive toad dragon. But as the smoke cleared, word soon reached the Chaos Dwarf Lord that this city was not Nuln. It was, in fact, Faldorf, a lesser city in the Empire. Upon learning this news, the Maggot Lord Tamurkhan became apoplectic. He ordered the Chaos Dwarves to lay waste to the city, and the Legion of Asgore were happy to oblige. The Chaos Dwarves showered the gambrel-roofed tower houses and warrens of narrow streets with incendiaries until the ruins blazed in a great conflagration. The pall of smoke from the burning city was clearly visible many leagues away in the wavering light of the following dawn, so that even from the high battlements of Nuln's outer curtain walls, Faldorf's dark fate was unquestionable. Tamurkhan's mistake did not go unnoticed, and it was this foolish error that was the cause of much acrimony and foreboding for the warriors of the Northlands and the servants of chaos. Both despise weakness, and some saw in it the cruel humor of the gods themselves, directed at Tamurkhan. Hundreds died as the malcontent of the Horde bore fruit over the following days. Fissures opened up within its unity, such as it was, until it began to split along divisions of race and dark faith. While Tamurkhan himself retreated within the private circle of Nurgle followers, burying himself for days in foul rituals to his master, the Lord of Decay. The Chaos Lords under Drazoath showed displeasure that they had expended valued munitions and machinery against the wrong target, and demanded recompense. And while Tamurkhan was sequestered in foul rituals, perhaps surprisingly, it was Sal the Faithless who stepped into the breach of leadership and offered them the right to a victim of their own, the fortified town of Drazhoath to the northwest, to keep them occupied, to besiege and despoil unimpeded as they saw fit. This they did with swiftness and brutal efficiency, taking the town by storm in a savage night attack, and sundering the gates with modified iron demon engines they called skullcrackers, fitted with steam-driven arsenals of massive pulverizing mauls and whirling scythe blades, which made appallingly short work of stone, wood, and flesh in their path. Supported by magma cannon fire and a searing cloud of ash conjured by Lord Drazhoath and his cabal of demon smiths to bedevil the defenders at the battlements, Drazhoath was taken largely intact, and the disciplined warriors of the Infernal Guard making short work of the defenders once they were within the walls, gunning down any who resisted and profaning the temples of the human gods with the blood of their priests and rededicating them to the supremacy of Hashut, constructing sacrificial pyres where once their altars had stood. Unfortunately for the townsfolk of Drazhoath and the refugees that had flocked there, they were offered no quick death, for the scions of Zarna Grund had come not to slaughter, but enslave, and soon the whole town became a fortified slave stockade as the Legion of Asgore took it over for their base of operations, quickly shoring up the defenses they had destroyed and cutting off the river crossing. Meanwhile, as the days ticked by like the passage of a clock's hand, the rest of the Horde began to slowly fracture into desperate warbands, pillaging almost aimlessly across the lands of the south of Nuln, while the forces of the Empire were content to rally in the great city and wait for the inevitable attack, each day bolstering their power slowly but surely. After more time spent raiding the lands of the Empire, eventually Tamurkhan came to his senses and called forth the Chaos Dwarves to join him on the final assault on the city of Nuln. As a column of Chaos Warriors started to march to the city, they sounded like the rumble of an oncoming storm. A disciplined 5-bar column of black iron and hissing steam, the Legion of Asgore. The burning wing shape of Cinderbreath, the Baal Taurus, circling low overhead his soldiers, with Drazoath gazing down with calculating malice on the scene unfolding below him. Then he had been in a position to observe. They may have divined that of the 3 armies that now snaked their way towards Nuln's walls, the Chaos Dwarves were the most cautious in their progress. And also, whereas the Horde had deserted the lands behind them, leaving them barren and empty, the Legion of Asgore had left the garrison to await them at the Karas and keep open a line of retreat. As Drazoath observed the battlefield, he noted that his enemies seemed to have learned from their past failings. They, it seemed, would not allow his guns to advance within range of the city itself. And to this end, nearly a full 1,000 knights, mounted pistoliers and free riders, had drawn up on the rolling downs to the west of the city, while serried ranks of state troops, halberdiers, handgunners, and cannon batteries awaited the Horde upon the raised banks of the flood levees that dominated the peninsula, where the mighty rivers of the Ava and the Upper Reich met. It was this boggy expanse that was the Empire's chosen killing ground, and the bulwark on which they hoped to shatter the Horde, in sight of the great city, but no closer. Among the thousands that defended the city of Nuln were more than mere soldiers, for this was a matter of faith, as much as survival to some. And for the insane, flagellant cults devoted to Sigmar and the zealots of a half-dozen other faiths, martyrdom in the face of the great enemy was a fate to be almost embraced. While at strategic points in the Empire lines, battle wizards from the colleges of magic awaited the ultimate test of their own arcane craft in the fight to come. The day of destruction was born slowly. Pale mists clinging to the damp earth, and 1,000 breathless prayers were offered up to the gods of mankind, and screamed in exultation to the lords of ruin. The sun rose up like a bloody beacon to light the way, and battle was joined. In the center of the Empire's line, a huge ball of fire suddenly soared high into the air before seeming to hang immobile in the sky like a second sun. Then, at last, it began the inevitable fall to earth. The plunging missile blazed so brightly that the whole army of the Empire was bathed in its angry light. The ranks faltered for a moment, and then the fiery orb struck the ground with a mighty crash, erupting into a ball of all-consuming flame. The whole battlefield felt the impact, and troops from both sides clung to weapons that shook in their hands. Horses bucked, and their riders struggled to hold them. So it was that the Legion of Asgore announced their presence. The fiery invocation had come from the center of a great iron-caged pyre, mounted on the back of an iron-wheeled altar, so large it needed to be pulled by 3 iron demon engines. And around it, Chaos Dwarves swarmed in uncanny and unnerving precision, forming a diamond-shaped deployment at the edge of cannon range from the levee defense lines of the Empire troops, quickly setting up fire positions with their snaking war machine trains, whose clanking and hellish hissing cries could be heard clear to the city walls. Where the fireball landed, nothing remained but a huge, smoking crater, a black pit upon a green field. Fortunately for the men of the Empire, the blazing missile fell just short of their main gun line and had instead obliterated one of the furthest forward battery dugouts, though some of the other gunners behind had abandoned their positions in sheer terror. They soon returned and began to open up with the full panoply of cannon and mortar at their disposal. White clouds of smoke broke out all along the front of the Empire army, and soon cannonballs could be heard whistling through the air in ferocious numbers as they plummeted upon the Chaos Horde. Within a short time, the artillery duel grew intense. Missiles of all kinds flew between the armies, and the battlefield was soon clouded with drifting gun smoke as the Horde, heedless to its casualties, drew inexorably on. Each side aimed to destroy the artillery of the other, as without artillery, either army would be obliged to close upon the other at a great disadvantage. The Imperial army possessed more cannons than the Chaos Dwarves, but at such long range, only the largest guns had enough reach to strike back at the Chaos Dwarf positions. And so, most were forced instead to try and thin the ranks of the Horde as best they could, before the inevitable and unholy charge. The death toll on both sides was hideous, and once the skilled gunners of the famous Nuln Artillery School found their range, they dropped the fire accurately into the Chaos Dwarf positions. One shot carried away an ogre loader who burst apart, showering the Hellsmith artillerymen with the creature's toxic innards. Another cannonball landed in a cache of mortar bombs and ripped a gash into the earth with an explosive blast which shook the ground for a league around and sent Infernal Guard flying into the air like scattered toys. The Chaos Dwarf-made weapons were designed for the slow pace of siege warfare, and their missiles were time-consuming to prime and cumbersome to load. For every shell that hurled towards the opposing ranks, 100 cannonballs spun and bounced towards the Horde. But, despite this, they accounted for themselves with lethal force. The firepower of the Chaos Dwarf weapons was suffused with all manner of horrific and demonic force, from great gouts of screaming power that devoured everything it struck, to bolts of molten metal hurled like blazing arrows across the field, and eldritch rockets which exploded their wrath high in the air to see it race screaming down with a diabolical intelligence to hungrily burn the flesh of its victims. Every missile the Chaos Dwarfs loosed towards the enemy inflicted intolerable damage. Cannon after cannon disappeared beneath a ball of flame, and soon the front ranks of the Imperial army were in visible disarray, although they held fast, their banners high in defiance. As Tamurkhan pushed from the middle, the battle raged on, and the Empire line began to buckle and be pushed back despite the desperate bravery and skill of the soldiery of Nuln. For against such wanton savagery and nightmare-birthed might, even they could not prevail. Sensing victory was at hand, the champions of Chaos howled their cries to their dark gods and pressed on with renewed vigor, their cruel and tainted blades rising and falling in a tumult of death, while rippling mutant beasts, already gore-splattered and panting, threw themselves at the foe with renewed hunger to kill and devour. Sile the Faithless led a charge of Kurgan knights along the western edge of the river, looking to overwhelm the Empire defenses. But through a system of pontoons they developed and floated down the river with gunnery positions, then, out of the sky, a sorceress on a carmine dragon descended. This was Elspeth von Draken. Sile the Faithless's Kurgan broke and fled. The day well advanced past noon, and the entire battlefield was a shifting mass of mud and mayhem, with thousands toiling and killing in the mire. The swathe of combat had interjected itself between the Chaos Dwarf contingent and the rearguard of the Empire guns, cutting short their artillery duel. In response, the Legion of Asgore had taken advantage of the respite to lick their wounds, and were now moving in column to redeploy to a more advantageous position to the west of the main battle line. Lord Drazoath had no intention of miring his troops in the slaughter before him, and already had paid more in blood and machinery than he cared for Tamurkhan's cause. Instead, he would be content for his legion to wait out the outcome of the carnage and make his plans accordingly. Preserving his war machines as needed, perhaps even shelling the battle indiscriminately should it go against the Chaos forces. It was then, however, that there was a sudden commotion in the rearward ranks of the enemy. From the western flank of the great melee, there burst a company of fresh mounted troops, who broke away from the Empire lines and skirted the edge of the battle, galloping towards the Chaos Dwarf position at breakneck speed. These were followed moments later by war engines, the like of which Lord Drazoath had never seen. Strange and spectacular, these four bizarre machines belched smoke and wheezed and clanked as if they were about to burst apart. At first, he thought them to be the famed steam tanks of the Empire, but soon realized they were something else entirely. They were huge creations, far larger than even his own iron demons, and fashioned incongruously in the image of sea warships, but hoisted high on wheels and propelled by some crude steam engine, which even at this distance sounded fit to explode at any moment. Their decks teemed with soldiers and were frantic with activity, and with sudden shock, he watched armored gun ports open in their bows to reveal the juttering barrels of cannon. Lord Drazoath swore some terrible oath in Dwarfish and immediately snapped orders to his attendants, who made haste to obey. And the column's machine train began to scream and clank slowly towards forming a defensive circle. The Chaos Dwarf Sorcerer Prophet watched the enemy's machines steam rapidly forward, and they did so at a far greater speed than he had ever seen any Chaos Dwarf engine of their size move. The landships, he realized, had distracted him utterly from the darting horsemen, which were now drawing close at the gallop. As these riders approached, Drazoath observed that some were armed with strange mechanical weapons of a kind he'd never seen before. Their use and purpose were quickly revealed when clattering gunfire, faster than any Drazoath had ever witnessed, bar from the weird, experimental weapons of the hated Skaven clan Scryer, rattled forth from the riders, spraying indiscriminately into the still-turning Chaos Dwarf column. The Infernal Guard moved lockstep into defensive positions and returned withering fire with firelock and hail-shot blunderbuss, shredding horses and riders alike. But Drazoath cursed foully again, seeing the damage was already done, as the riders were already in and amongst the column. Their target was now clear, as those few that still lived hurled iron sphere bombs with fizzing fuses into the guns and gears of the war machines and munition carriages, with devastating results. Lord Drazoath urged Cinderbreath into the air as the land ships closed quickly upon the siege mortars and magma cannon. Still stowed for transport, their hellsmiths frantically tried to make them ready to fire. With thunderous retorts, the land ships began to shower the weapon carriages with shot from their bow-mounted cannons and fusillades of small arms fire from the fighting decks. A well-aimed cannonball struck one of the vast mortars, and in a shrieking explosion, knocked it completely from its mounting. The Chaos Dwarf crew, lying dead and mutilated, amongst the mangled metal of their war machine. As the Chaos Dwarfs rallied to the defense, another wave of riders came through the trundling formation of land ships. There were near 100 this time, liveried in ivory cloth and enameled black armor, and armed with firearms of diverse kinds. Some carried multi-barreled muskets, some braces of pistols, and others bore brass-mouthed guns that gaped open like blunderbusses. The cavalry stormed around the weapon carriages, loosing their fire upon the crewmen and slaves, causing great slaughter. As they did so, hard-eyed swordsmen repelled into combat from the sides of the land ship and fought off all attempts by the dwarves of Zar to rescue their comrades. Engaged, Drazoath issued the mental command for Cinderbreath to plunge into the attack. The huge burning beast did as it was bidden, and Drazoath felt a thrill of pleasure as Cinderbreath bathed the deck of the nearest land ship in its breath of flame. The death screams of the crew caught in the open sweet music to the black-hearted sorcerer. With a sweep of his gnarled hand, he summoned the power of his dark god and covered the second landship in a pall of cloaking black ash, while the first careened away, burning merrily. More hooves thundered, vastly more, and Drazoath's alarm was replaced with triumph as hundreds of Kurgan horsemen thundered into view. But instead of joining the battle, they rode on by at speed, leaving the Chaos Dwarf sorcerer to shout bitter curses after them for their cowardice. Meanwhile, undeterred, the two remaining land ships turned clumsily, about to attack the next column of machine carriages. But by now, the Infernal Guard were engaged in a bitter fight with the enemy's horsemen and were quickly gaining the upper hand. Although the ragged-looking swordsmen fared better, their weird-looking standards seemed to shriek like a damned soul in torment. The land ships lumbered onwards, more slowly now, for it appeared that they had expended much of their power during their rapid advance, and they had taken fire from the Chaos Dwarves, and now steam spat from gaping holes in the machine's sides. One landship belched black smoke, and flames spluttered from its chimney stack as the engine backfired noisily. Its companions blundered about, one blindsided by ash and the other now blazing like a furnace, but the fourth incongruously slammed down its heavy anchor, using the drag weight to turn sharply, crashing into a detachment of Infernal Guard that had formed up to fire on it. Its bow cannon spoke suddenly, and grape shot lacerated the Chaos Dwarves, even their vaunted black shard armor next to useless against the cannon at point-blank range. Lord Drazoath launched Cinderbreath into a knot of enemy riders, and laughed cruelly as the Bale Taurus burned and gored them into unrecognizable hunks of scorched meat. The burning landship crashed into an iron demon head-on, and the pair exploded in a roaring fireball, which sent splinter shrapnel scudding across the battlefield and punching a hole through Cinderbreath's wing and ricocheting off Drazoath's armor. Bit by bit, the land ships were worn down, wheels blasted apart, boilers pierced and weeping, and weapons bent and useless. A skullcracker engine found one that had stalled broadside, its teeth bit into iron plate, and chewed a hole through the hull, with a cracking sound, and erupted from the other side in a shower of splinters, cutting the wooden beast in half. The few surviving riders and swordsmen beat a desperate retreat, as did the single rickety landship that remained, smoking and bullet-ridden, as fast as its off-kilter wheels would carry it. But the damage had been done, and the Chaos Dwarves were in no state to pursue. Treachery! Drazhoath howled into the skies, still angry at none of the Horde coming to the aid of the Chaos Dwarves. The battle would continue, but Drazoath decided that the Chaos Dwarf part in it was done. They would return home with what booty they could salvage, leading Tamurkhan to his fate. The battlefield had descended into a whirling melee, miles across, an orderless, leaderless slaughter on a nightmarish scale where no quarter was given, and the screams of the dying hung in the air, echoing as far as the streets of the great city, where refugees huddled in fear at the sound. The ground, already a morass of blood and mud, became a quagmire of gore and twitching bodies. The battle would proceed, but Tamurkhan would fall foul of the gods' favor and lose this day. Drazoath and his legion returned to the Black Fortress with their booty of slaves and Empire technology in tow. And that's the story of Drazoath the Ashen, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed it. Let's take a quick look at his rules on the tabletop. So Drazoath had the rule Dark Renown, which meant that all Chaos Dwarf units, including Drazoath himself, had a +1 to their combat resolution results if they were near him. He also had a couple of magic items, the Hellshard Amulet, the dark product of Drazoath's own labors in diabolic craftsmanship. The icy hate of his malice is caught and amplified 1,000-fold within its black crystal depths and unleashed upon any who dare spill his blood. This meant that the Hellfire Amulet gave a 5-up ward save, and for every successful wound that the amulet failed to stop in close combat, a strength 2 hit was automatically inflicted on the model that did it. He also has his Demon Spite Crucible, forged from meteoric iron and blighted gold, quenched in innocent blood, and bound with layer upon layer of hellbound souls. The Demon Spite Crucible is said to have been the handiwork of ancient Chaos Dwarf sorcerer Asgore himself. This bowl adds +1 to the bearer's casting attempts, and in addition, if Drazoath or Cinderbreath kills an enemy wizard in close combat, their soul stuff is consumed by the crucible, and the bonus increases to +2. And he has the Graven Scepter, a badge of rank carried by the Lords of the Black Fortress. This Iron Staff mace carries the runic names of the Masters of the Black Fortress since its founding, bound up with their baleful prayers of Hashut. This was a magic weapon that needs you to roll a 4-up to wound its target, regardless of enemy toughness, so it could really help against super tough enemies. He, of course, had his mount, his trusty mount Cinderbreath. And it is worth mentioning, I didn't really cover it a lot in the story, but in sort of halfway through the tale, it describes Drazoath as being half petrified. It's not really touched upon in great detail, it didn't affect the story too much, but it is maybe sort of a point of note that I'm just going to throw on here at the end, is that he is said to be half petrified at this stage, but, you know, in Total War Warhammer, he's a bit, maybe you could argue he's a bit younger, he's not really that petrified at this stage. But that's the way he is described in the story of Tamurkhan. Ladies and gentlemen, as always, it's been a while, but a huge thank you for watching, and I hope to catch you all on the next one. Alright guys, bye.